What's up guys, welcome back to Elderwood Games. Thomas here, and this week I wanted to talk about the exhibition games that Games Workshop had earlier this week and kind of talk through some of the changes for 11th edition that really stuck out to me that I think will have pretty good impacts, maybe major impacts on sort of the game as a whole, and some specific call-outs that maybe either haven't been fully ironed out in the Warcom articles or just things that I felt really stood out and were apparent in these games of Warhammer 40,000. And then of course at the end of this video I'm going to talk about my thoughts on the games and my thoughts on the vision of the new edition and how I think it's going to shake things up. I figured it would be best just to walk through basically all the changes as if it were us walking through a game together. So we're going to start with some pre-game things, then go through the command phase, movement phase, shooting phase, charge phase, fight phase, and end phase, just like we would with a regular turn of Warhammer 40,000, and kind of talk through each of the little hiccups along the way that came up during the games, and then that way we can kind of talk about everything in an order that would mostly make sense. So starting with pre-game things, so this is basically your list building and basically setting up the battlefield and getting things started. Firstly, I wanted to talk about your list building. So more specifically, when we're looking at tournament play, you will have to note which leaders are with which units prior to the game starting, and this would be on your tournament list submitted to the organization that is running the event. So that way you can't have any last minute list tailoring for something like the Tau battle shoots as an example. You can kind of shift around your commander before the game begins if you know that there's going to be, if you want to have a specific stratagem or a specific enhancement kind of tied to that unit, you're able to sort of do that. And in 10th edition that was completely viable because that was in the deploy army step. I believe for 11th edition it's still going to be within that step, but you will have to basically have it written out before the tournament. And I think that's just to encourage more balanced play and having less like kind of chicken noodle soup kind of armies where you can sort of shift things around to get an advantage on your opponent at the last minute, because not every army has that ability to do that. So honestly, I think that's overall a good change. Next up is the battlefield. As we already know, we're no longer standing on circles. Instead, we're standing in terrain features. And I think ultimately this proved to be a good change because most units, infantry, swarm, and beasts will be able to stand on objectives and have the benefit of cover. So -1 to hit against most things. And it's just going to overall protect things and help you to hold that objective for longer. And I honestly think that's just a good thing. I feel like a lot of times in 10th edition, while you could definitely force some like lines and that sort of thing, most objectives were in areas that weren't necessarily perfectly defended on all sides, but because of the nature of 11th edition and how cover works, as long as all your stuff is within the cover, it gets benefit of cover from any angle. So overall, I think this is going to be a good change. Next is the disposition system. As you may know, you have 5 dispositions to choose from, and your opponent chooses one of the 5 as well. You can choose the same one or obviously choose different ones, and you're able to choose one that's based on your army's specific guidelines, and you're able to tailor what kind of experience you're going to have by choosing one of these. And then when you do that and you compare it to your opponent, that determines what your primary mission is going to be in that game. And then your opponent is going to have an asymmetric kind of primary mission that counters what you're trying to do. So that way you have a little bit of an automatic sort of narrative that's ironing out, but also the things that you're trying to do are going to be thwarted by your opponent. And instead of it just being, stand in circles, stand near a circle and move it, it's going to be get into different areas of the battlefield. Most of them have a scoring by standing on an objective, but a lot of them feel a bit more thematic and trying to get into different areas of the board or defeat more enemies than your opponent and those sorts of things. So it does feel like you're going to have a lot of different playstyle options just from dispositions alone, and I really liked that. And lastly, in pre-game, for deployment and throughout the game, coherency is going to be important, and coherency has changed. So in 11th edition, all your models will have to be within 9 inches of each other, and they will have to be within 2 inches of your other models within it, so it cannot exceed 2 inches apart from that sort of thing, and then unit coherency, they'll fall off and that sort of deal. Ultimately, I think this is good. I think stringing units along felt a bit odd in 10th edition. Moving on to the command phase. So firstly, Battle Shock has a pretty big change. So as it currently runs in 10th edition, basically Battle Shock falls off at the end of turn, and then if you need to recheck for Battle Shock, you would roll the dice to determine that. It has changed. So basically, when you make your Battle Shock rolls in your command phase, not only are you rolling for units that are at half strength or less, versus currently they have to be below half strength, but in 11th edition, you'll roll for any unit that is at half strength or lower to determine if they're Battle Shocked. And also, if a unit is currently Battle Shocked, whether they're at half strength, full strength, something in between, they will have to roll Battle Shock to lift the Battle Shock from them. This also means that if you carry over Battle Shock into your turn, because they are Battle Shocked, you cannot target them with the Insane Bravery stratagem, so you won't be able to kind of force a unit to be able to, hold an objective or be able to do an action that turn and that sort of thing. You will have to rely on the rolls, and I think that's a pretty substantial change, just because the inability to use the stratagem, I think, is going to be pretty pivotal in some of the higher or more difficult leadership. Most of the other items on Battle Shock remain the same though. Your OC becomes null. You cannot perform actions. You cannot be the target of stratagems like we were mentioning before. One interesting note that one of the commentators mentioned, and keep in mind, they're learning the new edition. There's some things that I think they may say that are not intentionally misleading, but they may have said things that didn't fully line up with what the rules are actually going to be. But at one point, one of the commentators mentioned that they will get the army and detachment rules, and they said it more exclusionary. So I think there's going to be some level of change to what rules apply to Battle Shocked units. So I'll be interested to see if that was just a slip of the tongue, or if that was something that was said and it just wasn't elaborated on, because it didn't really come up from the commentator's point of view. Also, when you're Battle Shocked, if you fall back, then obviously you'll have to take hazardous checks when you do so. Hazardous is slightly changing, so now every model in the unit that makes a hazardous check on a 1 or 2 will take 1 mortal wound. If it's a monster or vehicle, it'll take 3. And obviously that could be pretty bad for smaller infantry, but overall it's a better change for, Terminators and bigger infantry and bigger models in general and that sort of thing. So a pretty, parallel kind of change, but overall I think is going to be good. But another call out here for Battle Shock is that some of the primary and secondary missions actually call out that units must not be Battle Shocked or aircraft, as it was kind of written in 10th edition. But this is also extended not only to ones that require actions, but also some that are location based. So, being behind enemy lines or in table quarters, some of those ones actually specifically say that they have to be non-Battle Shocked units, and that could really impact some scoring and that sort of thing. So I feel like it's an important thing to call out. With secondaries, as you probably already know, you'll be drawing 2 secondaries every turn, whether you have secondaries in hand or not. And I think this is ultimately a good thing. It showed very much in the exhibition games that this helps you along the way, because you're able to keep the secondaries that you might be able to score later, but you're not limiting yourself from drawing into new ones that you can score right away. So it actually helps you build up a more coherent kind of strategy over the course of the game, and can result in some pretty big swings later on. And we'll talk a little bit more about scoring maxes and stuff a little bit later. But overall, this was a very impactful change, I feel. And lastly, in the command phase, primary points. So we talked a little bit about the force dispositions earlier, but in the primary category, you'll have things that from the second battle round onward score at the end of the command phase. Most of these appear to be determined by objective markers that you hold outside of your deployment zone. but there are some other ones, it seems, as well, as they alluded to. But you'll also have end of turn effects that grant you points, and you'll also have, typically you'll have one that is an end of battle effect that applies a number of points based on what your conditions are. So you'll have 3 different areas within your turn to score points, but you'll have one that's end of any turn, you'll have one that is second battle round onward in your command phase, and you'll have one that is end of the battle. And you may have more in those categories. It seems like most have multiple in the end of turn category, but we weren't able to see all of them, so there could be multiples kind of sprinkled in. But out of the ones we saw, most people had about 5 ways to score primary on their primary action card. So keep that in mind. You're going to have plenty of ways to score those primary points from turn 1 going through all the turns. The movement phase. So some changes with movement. First off, fly. Fly units are going to be able to, quote, take to the skies by subtracting 2 from their movement and then be able to move up to their maximum movement after that -2 penalty. And they can move over terrain, through models, and that sort of thing. But obviously they can't end the move anywhere they can't land. So not on enemy models, not within engagement range of any models, not on top of terrain features that they can't fully sit on. And there's some other rules about like hull and stuff like that, not able to land on floors of certain terrain features. So keep that in mind. But overall, good change for fly. Next up is pivot. So pivot will no longer cost. As far as the exhibition goes, they did only show hull once. So it was a Rhino that they were showing the pivot rule for, but pivot didn't cost anything to do that. I don't know if oval bases will have a cost in pivot. I would imagine, just based on what they were saying, it won't have the cost, but we'll have to fully iron that out once we get the actual rules. Terrain appears to be having more keywords added to it, and certain terrain features will have keywords that will allow vehicles to move over them. So it doesn't seem like it's just going to be a certain height requirement. There will also be some that determine it. There's also going to be vehicles that have keywords that allow them to move through terrain they may not normally be able to move through based on the terrain keywords. So a lot more keywords, but I think hopefully they're going to be easy to manage and they'll be really straightforward, but we'll have to wait and see kind of what all that irons out to be. Outside of that as well, when you move, there is notably the new heroic intervention stratagem. Adding an additional CP cost to it will allow your opponent to be able to heroically intervene into you up to 6 inches, even if your unit did not charge. So you're going to want to make sure that you're staying outside of 6 inches of anything that you don't want to end the turn engaged with, because I can guarantee if the World Eaters player has 2 command points, they are definitely moving their berserkers into whatever can get close to him. A free 6 inches is going to be super viable in this edition. So just wanted to call that out here. I think that's a very pertinent thing for the movement phase specifically. And lastly, Overwatch now will happen at the end of the movement phase, and you can do it before you set up anything using an ingress move like Rapid Ingress, which means you can actually potentially clear the way for your ingress targets to come in before you have to do that, which I think is honestly kind of cool. I think that's an interesting interaction, and I don't think it actually came up in one of the matches, but the commentators were talking about that, and it was confirmed while they were talking about it that that is how that will work. So it will allow you to kind of potentially clear the way through some more than likely light infantry to be able to drop in something that is going to be a pretty relevant threat, and that sort of thing. Also, just as a note on Overwatch, it does use the snap shooting rule, and the snap shooting rule specifically states that you have to roll unmodified 6s, which is the same as in 10th edition, but these cannot be re-rolled, which is different from 10th edition. So your Oath of Moment re-rolls don't count. Any re-rolls you might have with Tau, such as the Fire Knight team. So torrent weapons get a big positive as being good Overwatch material, whereas anything that could re-roll before isn't really going to be as good of an option going into 11th edition. And speaking of shooting, we're now moving into the shooting phase. And the first big thing I wanted to discuss is the fast rolling mechanic. So this one came up a lot in the exhibition, and there were a lot of chat comments and stuff asking about how this is actually going to work, because admittedly it is a bit odd, but I think for the most part it makes sense and is going to be good, question mark, going forward. But let's kind of just break down what it looks like, so that way we can kind of determine for ourselves whether we think it's going to be good or not. So it's going to start with the attacker. The attacker is going to basically divide their unit into the different weapon profiles. And so, they specifically say that if it has the same characteristics that matter, you can roll them all together. I think it's personally just going to be easier to roll each weapon separately, just in case there is anything that interacts in a weird way. You can just call that out and it'll be a lot smoother. But as the attacker, you're going to separate out your different weapon profiles, and then your opponent is going to separate their defending units, or their defending unit, into the different save characteristics. And if there is a leader involved, they will also be considered a separate group in this case. Then the defender is going to say which of their groupings will take the saves first, second, third, potentially. But if there is a character involved, the character must always take it last. So the attacker will then roll to hit and then to wound, and then the defender, just like it is now, will roll their saves. So they'll roll a number of d6 based on the number of wounds, and then they will basically order those dice in ascending order, so from 1 to 6. And the defender will go through their first group and apply the ones, and ticking off, removing any models that die because of the damage. Then they'll apply all the 2s, all the 3s, all the 4s, 5s, 6s, until all the save rolls have been applied, and then that's when you kind of determine who's been removed. One kind of caveat to this, though, is Feel No Pains. It didn't come up with a mixed unit in the exhibition, but we can kind of surmise that this is going to work very similar to how it does now. So Feel No Pains will basically force slow rolling to happen unless they change how Feel No Pains work, which I don't think they can do really. But how I imagine it would go is if your unit has Feel No Pains, you assign the 1 to that unit, and then you roll your Feel No Pain for that. And then you apply the next one, Feel No Pain, next 2, that sort of thing. You could probably, if you have 5 dudes that are 1 wound apiece and it's incoming damage of 1 apiece, you could probably do them 5 at a time. And I think there will eventually get to a point where it's very smooth, but it could be a little bit of an odd sort of caveat that happens that could result in some slow rolling. But ultimately, it does seem that this is going to help protect your leader in more cases than slow rolling. But ultimately, it's going to be something that we really got to get used to. And that ascending order kind of thing makes it feel faster, I think. But it does also kind of take some agency away from you as the player, at least in my opinion, to be able to allocate saves to save your bodyguard unit more. But I don't think that's ultimately what Games Workshop wants us to do. So they kind of want to take some of the potential hangups that could happen during a game and iron those out, so that way we can have slightly quicker games and that sort of thing, which I mostly appreciate. One note about fast rolling is precision. So precision actually does flip it, so that way the character has to accept the saves first, which means the character will be assigned the 1s, the 2s, the 3s, and so on until they have been eliminated. So precision, unless there is a rewrite that happens before 11th's actual launch, unlikely, but could happen, precision is getting a major buff. This means that precision is more than likely going to be able to take out some characters a lot easier than it could currently, just because of the nature of how the fast rolling works. But granted, most precision things don't have a ton of shots. So unless they get really unlucky and have no viable saves, then you're probably going to be okay. But just depending on what shooting with precision, it could be pretty gnarly. And especially with combat, being able to do precision, I think that's going to be where it really takes the cake. But we'll have to wait and see if there's any rewrite to precision, or if there's any like points increases because of precision stuff, to see if that kind of gets factored out naturally. One special shout out for the shooting phase is we did get to see Tau get played, which I was very excited for, obviously. And it looks like marker light and guidance still work basically the same. So when you guide into a unit, you're still going to get that +1 ballistic skill, and the ignores cover keyword is still going to strip the new benefit of cover, which is that -1 to hit. So you're getting +1 to hit and revoking the -1. So you're actually going to still be shooting better than your base stat. So honestly, not hating it. We'll have to wait and see if there is a change, because it kind of sounded like, based on some of the conversations, that they basically just took the 10th stuff and they're applying it for 11th edition. But I don't know if the players that played got any updated rules or data sheets or that sort of thing. So there could be some potential errata before 11th launches, and that could slightly change. But at least for now, that appears to be how it's going to work. A next big thing is going to be with terrain. So any terrain that has windows or gaps or doors up to 3 inches off the ground level will be considered solid if it has the solid keyword. It sounds like that's going to be what tournament terrain is going to have. It's going to have the solid keyword, so your ground stuff behind walls is going to be safe. But any windows, gaps, doors, whatever, 3 inches or higher will be able to be shot through, either out of or into. So if you have things on the second story of certain things, they'll be able to be shot through the wall, kind of as if it's not there, but you will still get benefit of cover because you're in the terrain footprint. And that'll wrap up the shooting phase, and now into the charge phase. I discussed in a previous video kind of how the charge phase is changing, and you probably already understand it. It's been a pretty big topic among 40k YouTubers and stuff, but basically you'll roll the charge roll first, and then you can choose a unit that is within that radius from your model to be your charge target, or targets if you roll high enough or there's enough stuff around you. You will move towards that unit. You must end as close as you can to that unit if possible, and then the other units are able to be a little bit more kind of willy-nilly with that charge movement. And then of course when you pile in before fights actually start, you can kind of abuse that a bit. But it does sound like, a little bit at least, they thought about that and are kind of like forcing some of the you must end as close as possible, which I kind of appreciate in the language, and I hope that it irons out a bit more as well, and basically makes it so that way there's less ways to manipulate charges, just because it's one of those, like, it could feel kind of bad when someone's like, actually the rules say that I can do this, and it's kind of like, okay, yeah, great, like, whatever. Just my personal opinions. Also with charging, Crushing Impact is the new tank shock. So if you're a Tyranids player, you know that Crusher Stampede basically already kind of did this by giving us a pseudo tank shock, but now tank shock is going to be Crushing Impact, and it will allow monsters and vehicles to do it after they charge into something. It basically is going to work the same way. You're going to roll a d6 equal to your toughness value, and then any 5-ups are going to deal a mortal wound to your opponent. However, now when you roll a 1, it deals a damage to you as well in the form of a mortal wound. So they're going to be a bit more, when you crush into something, it might crush you back a little bit. So just hope that you don't roll all 1s and end up killing yourself in the process. But ultimately, I think this is a good change. I like the idea of being able to charge in and crush stuff with my monsters in Tyranids and other armies as well. Next up is the fights phase. So with the fights phase, the very first thing that both of you will do, starting with the active player, is any pile-ins. So you'll move up to 3 inches into closest enemy models, similar as we do it now, except it all happens at one time. The active player will do all of theirs. The non-active player will do all of theirs. and then we move into the fight phase with fights first. So fights first is slightly changing. Basically now, instead of the opponent acting first, now the active player will act first with their fights first units. However, it will be alternating. So if I'm the active player and I charge in with something, my fights first unit will fight first. And then if my opponent has any fights first units, they will go. Then I will go on to my next fights first, and then they will go. And you do that back and forth until there are no more fights first units. And that could mean if one player has more fights first units than the other, then they will be able to repeat activations until they finish all of their fights first activations. One slight change though is that whoever ends the fights first step, the opposing player gets to start the fights step. So they get to pick the ongoing fight to start things off, and then you go back and forth in the same way. And of course, if it ends up that one player has fewer ongoing fight activations to do, one player will get to repeat activations until all units have been selected and fought this turn. Ultimately, I think this is a good change. To be completely honest, I thought in the beginning of the edition, that's how fights first was supposed to work. And it felt like, to me, that's how it should work. But as far as I can tell, I think this is going to be good. And it'll feel a little bit more like back and forth and that sort of thing. I am a little curious if the interrupt stratagem is going to change, and whether or not a non-fights first unit would be able to interrupt into the fights first kind of step, or if they're going to kind of rule it so that fights first is like only fights first units can fight in this area and then all others fight here, but you might be able to basically interrupt and be able to fight before your opponent does if your opponent would start that second phase. And then of course we wrap the turn sort of in the ending phase, sort of the cleanup phase, where you score your points. So as I mentioned before, your primary is going to have at least one end of phase or end of turn points for you to rack up. Most of them seem to have 2 or 3, so you'll be calculating that. You'll also calculate any secondary points that you would gain at the end of the turn, and you are able to still discard a secondary card to get a command point, but you're a little bit less incentivized to do it unless it's just something that your army is not going to be capable to do by turn 5, so that you can kind of stockpile your secondary missions. It feels bad, I think, to discard, and the commentators were talking about this as well, and I do agree with them pretty much, that it's going to feel bad to discard secondaries, and we're likely going to see more people run the command point farming units that get command points at the beginning of turns, just because you're going to want to hold on to secondaries throughout the game to be able to potentially have bigger, swingier turns in the end, especially if you have a slower first couple of turns. Another kind of notable thing about point scoring is that basically primary is going to be limited to 15 victory points per battle round, and secondary is going to be limited to 15 points per battle round. So you can't like score all 6 secondary cards that you may have and rack up 30 points on secondaries. You will be maxed at 15, but it does sound like in this edition you will be able to hold on to secondaries if you wish to basically not score them right away. So, you know, if you get no prisoners and you only kill one thing, you don't have to just immediately cash that in for the 2 points. You can instead hold on to it and wait until a turn where you score maybe the max 5 or at least 4 points to be able to cash it in on that turn, which I think is a good change. Those are the changes that I noticed most in the exhibition games. Please let me know if I missed anything down in the comments below, or if I got anything wrong that you interpret it in a different way, or anything like that, because obviously this is a new edition. We're supposed to be having the new rules fairly soon, so I am excited to read through those and be able to talk more about those things and be able to bring more insight onto some of the things I may have gotten slightly wrong in this, and be able to clear up some of the things that I wasn't sure about in this video. But I did want to take a moment and talk through my thoughts on the games and my hopes and expectations for 11th edition. Ultimately, watching those 3 games has me very excited for 11th edition. Honestly, one thing about 10th edition that I don't really like is that if you have a bad turn 1 and turn 2, you're pretty much stuck on the back foot for the rest of the game. The challenger cards helped a little bit, but because of some of the backlash from competitive players when they got released, they just ultimately became non-existent, even in casual circles. So it still felt like you were pretty stagnant on the back foot for the first 2 turns. But watching the players in these exhibitions, keeping in mind that most of them are competitive players or players that effectively play as part of their full-time job, meaning they're really good at the game basically. In almost every game, one player started on the back foot and at one point in the game was like half of their opponent's victory points. And in some cases, that player was able to win the game and basically skyrocket ahead because of the kind of banking the secondaries, the primaries being able to be eventually outpaced, and it not just being a overall like who can stand on more circles for longer. And it's not really a battle of attrition for most of it. It's more of, okay, how can I utilize my secondary cards to be able to generate enough points to be able to get back into this? And also, what are my primary scores? And how can I basically take primary from my opponent and limit what they're trying to do while still being able to advance my board state and be able to build on my own points? And I feel like that's going to be more of a fun interaction and kind of tickle or scratch the itch of being more of a like general of your army, to be able to say like, okay, you know, we had a rough start, but here's how we can take the ground and basically run it to the end and that sort of thing. And I really liked that aspect of it. And it felt less like every turn was choreographed, like this is how many points I'm going to win, this is how many things they're going to win, and you just kind of know from basically that turn 3, like this is more than likely how the rest of the game is going to pull out, unless one of us draws absolute crap out of the secondary deck. Basically, this is how the game's going to go. And it feels fresh, it feels good, and I'm really excited for that aspect of the game. I do think some of the mechanics, like the fast rolling, some of the unit coherency, the 2-inch engagement range, and just a few other kind of like housekeeping rules are going to be things that are going to take time to get accustomed to. I think a lot of us are very much in the rhythm of 10th edition, and some of these are going to kind of shake that rhythm up a bit. But ultimately, I think that once we get the hang of it, we'll be able to learn how to tailor our lists in a way that we can sort of monopolize on what we're trying to do and be able to find, you know, the specific primary missions that we're going to be really good at, and we're going to be able to narrow down our force disposition to maybe 1 or 2 different ones, and be able to kind of see what our opponent is bringing and be able to say like, okay, I think I'm going to pivot into, you know, reconnaissance, or I'm going to pivot into vanguard assault, and like basically choosing which one you think is going to be more tailored to your opponent, and then seeing what your opponent does and seeing how your primaries are going to interact. I think it's going to be a fun aspect to the game that is going to basically make more games feel different, instead of, you know, 9 times out of 10 drawing linchpin, because I swear that's what happens every week at our shop. One person is playing linchpin. I don't know how it always ends up being the one that is picked, but it does, and it's crazy. But I think we're going to see a lot of a shakeup. I think we're going to have a very fun opening to the edition where everyone's trying to figure that out, and everyone's going to be trying out the different force dispositions. And I think it's going to be a bit of a chaotic time, but ultimately it's going to be a lot of fun, kind of sort of breaking the game, or like solving the game, as some people will say in Magic the Gathering, of like solving the meta and kind of figuring out what's going to work best for your list, but also knowing that you can kind of pivot into the other lists of your army and be able to pivot into different units to maybe be able to take on a different force disposition from week to week, and be able to kind of alter your force and have a lot more fun with your army and have some agency in that, instead of it being a random draw of the card as to what you're going to actually end up playing. I know this one was a bit of a longer one. Thank you guys so much for watching here until the end. I really do appreciate it when you do so. But obviously, like I said before, if I missed anything, please let me know down below. And also let me know what you're really interested in for 11th edition, and I'd love to talk about it down in the comments below. But thanks again so much for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one.